On Tuesday, June 16th, 2015, Donald Trump descended on a golden escalator to the lobby of Trump Tower and announced that Mexicans were rapists. America laughed because the whole thing was ridiculous. Well, some of America laughed. Some of America didn't. Some of America decided this was excellent. Some of America decided this was just the kind of message they needed to hear. Trump was the immigrant, took our jobs meme made pustulant flesh. Some of America, mostly white, mostly male, decided this was exactly what America needed. But to grow up white and male in a system that's specifically designed for you to succeed and yet not succeed, well, that's embarrassing. And Trump was giving those white males a way out. They could blame immigrants, which, let's be honest, a lot of those white males already did. But Trump was saying the quiet part out loud. And on November 8th, 2016, some Americans, mostly white, mostly male, took the out that Donald Trump was handing them, and they made him president of the United States. I'm an immigrant. My parents, along with my brother and I, arrived in the United States on January 20th, 1970. I was 2 years old. I wasn't born here, but this is the only home I've ever known. So I joined the immigrant resistance mostly behind the safety of a large, shiny computer screen. And I raised my voice along with the rest of my immigrant brothers and sisters in renouncing his xenophobic bullshit. The first talk that I wrote during the Trump administration was titled How to Fight Fascism. And it ended with a slide that said, made by an immigrant, a slide which I've copied over into every talk that I've given since then. I was very proud to stand defiantly in front of that slide at the end of my talks. I convinced myself that I was standing in solidarity with other immigrants in the crowd, and I was. But there was a word missing. Yeah, I am an immigrant, but my lineage is just a little bit more complicated than that. Because I'm a Portuguese immigrant. My people were in shipping. And as Letty in Lovecraft Country so succinctly put it, that means slavery. If you're African American, there's a very good chance that my ancestors and your ancestors crossed paths, and that your ancestors were free before meeting mine, but not after. Portugal invented the Atlantic slave trade. The Portuguese rounded up free people, imprisoned them in forts, and packed them in ships. Portuguese vessels carried an estimated 5.8 million Africans into slavery, mostly to Brazil, but also to the United States. The first Portuguese came to America in the stolen bellies of stolen African women. And while historians, mostly Portuguese, will tell you that Portugal was a minor player by the time the Atlantic slave trade reached its zenith, it's kind of like saying that a fire isn't your fault because the match that you used to light it has gone out. These are my people. They were in shipping. They were slavers. And if we're going to make a case for intergenerational trauma, I believe it's not only fair, but necessary to also make a case for intergenerational sin. We do not get to stand up here and ask for a medal to solve a problem we had such a large hand in causing. I am telling you these things because it makes me uncomfortable to tell you these things. In her excellent book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, Isabel Wilkerson makes a fantastic argument that America is a caste system defined by color, and that color is an American invention. Before America, we were Fulani, we were Belgian, we were Kanuri, we were Irish, we were Congo, we were Portuguese, we were Polish. America made us black and white, and it chained black people to the bottom and expanded and contracted the definition of white as needed to make sure that black people stayed on the bottom. One of the surprises of the 2020 presidential election was that Trump's percentage of immigrant voters grew. And by surprised, I mean that my non-immigrant friends were surprised. I was not surprised. Let's talk about immigrant racism. To look at me, I'm white. And I've certainly benefited from my skin color throughout my life. But whiteness was a suit that I had to learn to wear, because when my family moved to Philadelphia in 1970, they were moving into one of the most racist cities in America at the time, presided over by racist Mayor Frank Rizzo. And we moved into a small Portuguese community in a majority black neighborhood. And we moved into homes and businesses recently vacated by white flight. We came in as Portuguese, but we needed America to make us white, because that is how America defines success. And like every other immigrant group coming to America, we were here for success. And Frank Rizzo was happy enough to call us white when he needed our votes. So we hung the Rizzo re-election signs in our storefronts, and later we would hang the Reagan signs, and then eventually the Trump signs. And we crossed the street when black people came our way. And we hired our own. And we adopted all the slurs of the white Americans who were already here, and we brought some of our own. Our goal was to achieve whiteness as America defined it, which meant hating blackness and hating immigrants. Every immigrant group that comes into America wants to be the last immigrant group through the door. Trust me, immigrants would rip the plaque off the Statue of Liberty faster than a Proud Boy at a Tiki Torch Black Friday sale. And every immigrant group knows that the secret to achieving whiteness is to wait patiently in the wings until the current whites believe that black people are catching up, at which point the books are open and the Irish are let in, or the Ukrainians are let in, or the Czechs, or the Cubans, or the Portuguese. We all get to be white if we wait long enough. In America, whiteness is a reward for stepping on black people's necks. So no, seeing that Trump had gotten more immigrant votes in 2020 than in 2016 didn't surprise me at all. After all, when I attempted to talk to my own family about his xenophobia and his racism, my mother's reply was, "Oh, he didn't mean immigrants like us." There's always an immigrant group on deck for achieving whiteness. And they're voting for their turn at bat. And my family did indeed vote for him. But when you say that immigrants don't vote in their self-interest, that's not true. We are voting in our self-interest. We understand how this country is designed to work. We're playing by the rules that you set. We did indeed learn it from you, Dad. I am telling you these things because it makes us both uncomfortable when I tell you these things. Let's talk about shame for a second. I was recently having a conversation with a friend about how people we know and believe to be good people continue to work at places like Facebook, despite the overwhelming evidence that places like Facebook are, bad places run by bad people. And we discussed the obvious suspects: a good salary, being saddled by overwhelming student debt, fancy job perks, the need for benefits, and all those things are true to some extent. But I believe the biggest reason they continue to work at places like this is shame. Because once you admit your involvement in something terrible, you have to deal with your shame. And I'm not even talking about admitting your involvement to others. I'm talking about admitting it to yourself. To admit that you've spent years working on tools to dismantle democracy is a shameful thing, especially if you've continued working on them long after the point where it was obvious that what you were working on was complicit in dismantling democracy. And the easiest way to keep that shame at bay is to not admit that those things are bad, which is one of the reasons that companies distract you with things like good salaries and fancy job perks and swordfish in the cafeteria on Thursday, because these things are shinier than the shame. If you ever find yourself in Lisboa, and I encourage you to go because it's a lovely multicultural city now, and you may find yourself staring at one of its marvels, the magnificent monument to its seafaring past, Os Descobrimentos. The monument points out over the Rio Tejo like a giant arrow, and it's adorned along the sides by action-posed statues of the great navigators of Portugal, my forefathers. This monument is a bauble. This monument is meant to take your mind off of other things. Because just 6 kilometers to the east of that monument, and I encourage you to walk because it is a lovely walk, you'll walk into the Building Velho, which means old pillory. It's a public square. And it once served as Portugal's premier slave auction. If you walk a kilometer to the northwest of that, you'll end up at Rua do Poço dos Negros, the street of the Negro pit, where my ancestors threw the lifeless bodies that they'd exhausted into a pit. There's no monument in either place. In fact, there's no monument or museum in Portugal dedicated to its slaving past. We don't erect monuments to shame. In fact, our slaver past can best be summed up by this quote from Renato Epifanio, president of the International Lusophone Movement. Anyone who knows anything about Europe has to agree that Portugal is probably the least racist country in Europe. This can and should be one of our greatest causes of pride. It can't, and it shouldn't. The smallest asshole at the asshole party is still an asshole. But let's go back to the United States, because I am telling you these things and making myself uncomfortable only to make myself feel better about how uncomfortable I'm about to make you. After all, we were slavers because there was a market for it. But the hand of the market isn't always invisible. It has fingerprints. Now, I'm white. But for the first 2 decades of my life, being an immigrant was my defining characteristic. The neighbors saw me as an immigrant. The other kids at school saw me as an immigrant. My teachers saw me as an immigrant. The officer at the unemployment office, where I'd go with my dad to serve as a translator, saw me as an immigrant. And coming home crying after getting my ass kicked at school, only to have my mother tell me, "This is their country, not yours," made sure that feeling like an immigrant was etched deeply into my foundation. But once I left my immigrant bubble to go to college, I got to put on my white suit. On a college campus, I was now surrounded by people who I could choose or not choose to reveal my immigrantness to. I'd achieved the dream. I've climbed the caste system, and I was achieving whiteness. Suddenly, being a white man, everything I achieved was a product of hustle, hard work, and intellect. And it felt like you could get away with anything. It felt great for a while until it didn't. And that was right around the time when I found out that although, yes, indeed, I was an immigrant, the history of my own people was just a little more extra than most. It wasn't talked about at home or in the community where I grew up. And we didn't have Google back in the day. We didn't have Wikipedia. I found out during a conversation I was having with a Black classmate in college, and we were just talking about, where we come from. And I mentioned that I was an immigrant. And he said, "No shit, where from?" I said, "Portugal." And his face changed. And his body language changed. And I asked him what was up. He said, "Oh, you don't know?" And I didn't. So he told me. And we both kind of avoided each other after that, unsure of how to handle it. I'm sure I didn't handle it well. That was shame. And as an immigrant, you get to be excited about America's future while taking a mulligan on its past. But as a Portuguese immigrant, well, my people were in shipping. We're the foundation of America's past. There's a line in Ijeoma Oluo's excellent book, So You Want to Talk About Race, that I've used in essays and talks before, and it bears repeating here. If you are white in a racist society, you're a racist. If you're a man in a sexist society, you're a sexist. Which means, if I may mansplain for a second, that people who look like me get these privileges regardless of whether we want them or not. And I'm quoting this line again because the first time I read it, my reaction was that obviously this didn't apply to me. How could it? I'm so woke. I put up a slide saying that I'm an immigrant at the end of all my talks. I'm pulling out this quote one more time because of how deeply uncomfortable it made me the first time I read it. It covered me in shame. Of course, the line applied to me. The first time I read that line, I spent the next 20 pages of the book attempting to read what she had written, but it wasn't sinking in because I kept going back to this line and I couldn't hear what she had to say because all of my energy was going towards keeping that shame. The shame that her words had awoken in me from actually hitting home. And I'm ashamed to say how long it took. But once I accepted that this was true, I could actually hear what she had to say. And I had to acknowledge my own discomfort and shame for that to happen. And that's when the work begins. Now is the time for people who look like me to acknowledge that discomfort and that shame. Now is the time for people that look like me to be uncomfortable. In 20 years of running our own studio, we have hired exactly one Black person. And I could say something about the pipeline, yada, yada, yada. And I could say something about how you can only hire who applies, yada, yada, yada. But once all of those excuses, the excuses that you use to attempt to cover up your shame, are exhausted, you are left with an undeniable truth. We have hired exactly one Black employee in 20 years. That's a fact. And it's a fact that makes me very uncomfortable. And uncomfortable is where I need to be. Uncomfortable is what I need that fact to make me. It's also a fact that most of the companies in our industry are no better. You have not hired enough Black people either. And if seeing this is making you uncomfortable, good. Oh, but Mike, isn't this a quota system? Maybe. But this definitely is. Believing that every white dude that walks through the door is qualified by default, that's definitely a quota system. And it's the longest running quota system in world history. You said Black Lives Mattered. On March 13th, 2020, Breonna Taylor was asleep in her bed when 3 Louisville violence workers busted into her house and murdered her in her own bed. And they got away with it. On May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis violence workers. He was handcuffed. He was thrown to the ground. And a violence worker lodged his left knee into George's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And George Floyd used what breath he could muster to tell the surrounding violence workers who were just standing there watching this happen that he couldn't breathe. And he told them that about 30 times. How many times does somebody need to tell you that they can't breathe? How many times does somebody need to tell you that you are killing them? How many times can you hear that and ignore it? And they got away with it too. This is America working as designed. The caste system that was designed not just by America, but in order to create America. White on top, black on bottom. A caste system that was systematically enforced, first by slavery, then by Jim Crow, Klan, redlining, restrictive covenants, racist police unions, and every newspaper headline about the loss of property over the loss of human life. And our government itself, which attempted a coup by throwing out votes in the majority black cities of Detroit, Atlanta, and Philadelphia. And when that didn't work, a racist mob, spurred on by an American president, invaded the Capitol building carrying a white supremacist flag. This is who we are. America is so dedicated to its racism that most conversations, even and especially white liberals' conversations about healing, still revolve around pardoning Trump and finding common ground with his base. Or unity. Let's find unity with the people who want to kill us, which is like treating a bullet wound by polishing the gun. A few days before that coup, we were counting votes in Georgia and thanking black women for saving the republic. By Sunday of that week, we were extending an olive branch to people who think they should be allowed to own those same black women. So in the summer of 2020, part of America took to the streets, spearheaded by Black Lives Matter, who in the middle of a pandemic managed to organize millions of people safely so that they were masked and they were socially distanced. And they organized and they held peaceful protests in cities and towns around the country. And they were met by violence workers as well. In the wake of these protests, companies and organizations and corporations posted pronouncements in support of Black Lives Matter. Your company may have been one of them. Some promising donations, some promising to change their own cultures, some promising both. Some telling you how woke they were, some letting you know they would have voted for Obama a third time. And we should beware that some of them think they just did. And while we could spend forever debating how many of those pronouncements were cynical, it's going to be more than zero, and how many were genuine, which is going to be less than 100, for our purposes, the important part is that they did it, and they did it publicly, which in the business is what we call a receipt. Now is a great time to ask the people who made those pronouncements what their next step is. Now is a great time, if you work at one of these companies or if you lead one of these companies, to hold yourselves accountable. It will make you uncomfortable. Let it. Let it. You said Black Lives Mattered. Now prove it. The future is going to bring white men with stupid hot takes and even stupider solutions. We cannot seem to help ourselves. Look, it's what we do. Like colonizers with smallpox blankets, we show up. We show up looking to solve the problem that we caused. But we will always figure out a way to solve these problems to our own benefit. We hope to profit from the disease that we caused and the cure. Some of the white folks helping to pull down racist statues thought they were clearing space for statues of themselves. The truth is that I hope we are done idolizing individuals. Individuals are always going to let you down. We do not get to speak for people whose ancestors we silenced. We get to listen. We get to stop hogging the space. Space wasn't ours to begin with anyway. So if anything, we're belatedly giving it back as we should have. And if this makes us feel uncomfortable, uncomfortable is where we need to be. I'm talking in praise of discomfort because discomfort is where we need to be. For years, for decades, for centuries, if you looked like me, you got to live in a world that was very specifically designed to make you comfortable. And the fact that you individually weren't able to achieve something with this doesn't mean it didn't exist. It means you couldn't score from third on a double. You can turn your shame and discomfort into rage, as so many Trump voters did, or you can own it. You can claim it. Because it's just sitting there and it's yours. So pick it up. And in doing that, you can keep from passing it on to the next generation. You can be a better ancestor than the ones you got. You can be a better ancestor than the ones I got. And there's absolutely going to be a role for people who look like me. But it's going to be a role that we're not so accustomed to. It's going to be listening rather than speaking. It's going to be about giving rather than taking. It'll be as part of a community. And if we're lucky, we'll have as much of a chance to succeed as anyone else in that community. If we're lucky, that community will give us more of a chance to succeed than we gave others. And that community's welfare will be the most important barometer to success. If we're lucky, people will treat us better than we treated them. It'll make us uncomfortable. And that's good. It's a good start. Thanks for listening.